One. Welcome back, everyone. Welcome back, Rabbi Ken Spiro.
Always good to be back.
Amazing. We are starting to think, well, we're actually in the midst of thinking about Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur and Elul. Elul is the month before the high holidays, where Jewishly we reset. Like we try to get back to zero. We try to come back to reflecting on how we did this year, realigning ourselves with our values, and sort of reconnecting with who are we, what are we up to, where are we going. So we wanted to do, I think you mentioned a bit of a continuation actually of our last episode, where we're going to take a look at getting back to values. So where should we start?
So I think, Ellie, we talked the last episode and everyone should go back and listen to it because it was a real eye opener to understand, how much in country to what has been taught, how much really humanity getting back to the Bible in the early modern period was the most transformative force, not in religion as much as it was in the development of modern political ideology and the creation of liberal democracy. So speaking about return to something that worked, that in turn produced something that has been the most successful form of government in human history. And we also talked about how, the threats like coming from the radical Islamic world, where the Iranians are screaming death to America and death to Israel, and that America is the great Satan and Israel is the little Satan, and that Israel is the source, and America, Israel meaning Israel, not the modern state, but the Jewish people is Israel, is the source, and America is the symbol of Western liberal democracy, which has been the greatest political innovation in human history that has literally led millions of people out of poverty into a system of government which may not be perfect, but has given opportunity and wealth and health and prosperity and freedom and stability to more people than any other system of government in the world. So I think it's probably because there was so much stuff stuck into that episode,
Mm-hmm.
kind of understanding a little more of the process and why it happened in America and we have the biblical Jewish model and we have the modern model. What can we learn from the past? Because we Jews aren't into advocating a Jewish theocracy that runs the world. That's never been our vision. What can we learn about what does work that the world really needs today, especially the United States, as the symbol of that liberal democracy? And what are the pitfalls that we need to avoid? Because, there's that great line from George Santayana, you don't learn from the past, you're destined to repeat it. And Elie Wiesel, the Nobel Prize winning author, Holocaust survivor, he had a great line. He said, there's one thing we learned from the past, it's we don't learn from the past. So
Right.
with the world
Yeah, for sure.
in such a
Just ask
precarious
ask any
position.
parent.
Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. We kind of like peaked out after World War II, the triumph of democracy and everything just exploded in terms of prosperity and so much growth and the spread of democracy. And it hasn't been a perfect world, but it seems to be things are stalling out here. So
Yeah,
maybe we need.
I heard a great quote the other day. I was listening to a conversation, and they gave this Hasidic quote, which is, "If things are so bad, how come they're so good?" And it was such an interesting way to think about it because I really feel like, in North America, that's what it feels like right now. Like things are really bad, but we have running water and like we're living like the kings of 200 years ago, and yet like things don't feel good. So, what is going on there? And I think just to say as a follow up from the last episode, I think the most eye opening part for that for me was realizing how much secular democracy, quote unquote secular democracy, is actually built on religious values, and that was really, I think, super important that most people don't understand that we are actually living in a world that is still shaped by religion.
100%. 100%. It's also funny, and just to comment on what you said about things are so bad. How come things are so, if America is so evil, why is everyone trying to cross the border and get to there,
Right, right.
unless it's a bunch of masochistic immigrants who want to suffer somewhere worse. The
Right.
problem within the world in general is people don't travel enough. The places that are the worst parts of the world are not the places you can go and visit.
And
So
not the places you want to go and visit, or
and you
you
don't
are
want to go
trying
visit it.
desperately to move there so bad that you're trying to do it illegally and sneak through the
Yeah.
border and
Take a
all of
trip.
that stuff. Yeah.
Take a trip to North Korea. You'll see exactly. You probably won't get out, but But yeah, that's a very good point. That's a really good point. But I think a really interesting place to begin is we talked a little about the Pilgrims and how much of America was founded on these values and how much, and we talked about how the Bible was reintroduced with the printing press and the Protestant Reformation 500 years ago. But just to go into that a little deeper, when you see, the United States was not founded by the Pilgrims and the Huguenots, but they kind of poured the foundations for the house.
Mm,
Idea of we're going to a new start and a new piece of real estate. We're escaping the persecution. These guys were basically Protestant refugees from largely Catholic countries, or even in the case of England, from the Church of England, they were more transformative, radical thinkers in terms of their ideology. So they viewed their journey. We said this last week. Their journey was like crossing the Atlantic, is leaving, Egypt to go to this Mount Sinai. Was the Pilgrims literally viewed
right.
Plymouth, Massachusetts, as this new covenant thing. But it's again really worth focusing on how precisely you have a bunch of people who rediscover the power of the Bible, of an absolute standard of values that comes from a perfect being called God. And it's not just moral values, it's a political constitution of a governmental system. But when America becomes a state in 1776, and it becomes an independent nation, is no longer run by those people. Many of the founding fathers of America, while being God believers, are largely were deists. A lot of them were Freemasons, by the way. It's very
Hmm.
interesting.
That is
They
interesting.
definitely. So what they may not have been so into the idea of an organized religion, and definitely were not into the idea of a theocracy, but they were very much into the idea of an infinite being who gives a standard of values to the United States. And when America creates its government, which I also mentioned last week, that the government of the United States is basically modeled after the biblical government of Israel. The only difference is in biblical Israel, there's a king. And even though George Washington was offered to be king, he agreed to be president.
Right.
But and by the way, he's still till today the most popular U.S. president ever, George Washington. He kind of ran uncontested, I guess, initially. But they said they replaced a president with a king, and they didn't institute biblical law into the United States.
Hmm.
Like
Right.
church and state, and separation of church and state is not that there's no religion in America, but it's this freedom of conscience. And most countries in the world, in Europe, even when they evolved into democratic states, do have state religions, even though they allow freedom of conscience. There's a Church of England, and France is a Catholic country, and Spain is a Catholic country, even though today, sadly, and this is one of the problems, these people, these modern democracies of Europe that came from Christian states, have largely lost their Christian faith and are mostly secular or minimally connected to their faith.
Right.
But in the United States, they didn't set up a theocracy. Maybe the original colonies of the United States, when they had their own little constitutional systems of laws, they were basing them on biblical law, and they had very strict
Hmm.
laws, by the way, of mandatory Sabbath observance and mandatory church attendance. And these were all things that the US did not incorporate into the United States government. But what it did set up was a system of separation of powers, a judiciary which is independent from the monarchy. So they had checks and balances,
Yep.
separation of powers. But the most amazing thing that America set up, which is truly overlooked, is the Constitution of the United States.
Hmm.
Because the Constitution, you think about, speaking about going back to the past to understand the future, the great innovation of Judaism in history is the notion of what we call ethical monotheism, that there's an infinite being who you don't vote for him. He's there whether you like it or not. And his judgment is perfect. And the laws he gives us are immutable. You can adapt the principles. There's wiggle room in there. Judaism is not this totally rigid system.
Right.
Technology changes, realities change, but the basic principles, and this is what is so powerful in Jewish law, it's not based on precedents of what is acceptable in this generation becomes unacceptable in later generations. So what is legal now becomes illegal later. Is based on principles that are immutable, in which there's room to interpret and apply, but it all falls within certain red lines. When the founders of the United States in the late 18th century, when they had the Constitutional Convention, which came after the Declaration of Independence, they basically set up a system of basic rights that are these all these different, US are this article, this article, this article. The first one is freedom of speech, which is arguably the
Right.
most important of all of them, the
Right.
right to express yourself. And the goal of the Supreme Court ultimately was the interpretation. It's kind of, there's a lot of parallels, kind of like the Sanhedrin, the highest court. Ultimately, they're trying to, the goal of the rabbis throughout history, even when we lost our state and lost our government and didn't have a high priesthood that was functioning and didn't have a king because we no longer had a country, the rabbis kept us going. And their goal was to preserve the law, pass it on, and basically adapt it to the changing situation of the Jewish people, which changed dramatically. Judaism was designed as a system to be kept in the land of Israel. How do you survive as a nation without a national homeland? And most of your laws are designed to connect you to your land and allow you to grow and express your vision in
Right.
that piece of real estate. Yet we managed to survive and to a very significant extent do that. But it's the adaptation and it's passing on, preserving, adapting, and applying that legal system. If you think about it, the Supreme Court of the United States, which is a very unique body, is very similar to that. We're going to take a system. We have this Constitution, which can be amended and added to. It's been amended and added to many times throughout the history of the United States. And we take everything that comes up as a legal case. Ultimately, when it gets to us, the Supreme Court judge, we're going to go back to the basics and see how it compares to what the founders had in mind. So while it's not exactly the same system, think about it. Whatever is, if you have an idea that works, whatever is as close to that idea as possible, even if it's not the exact same idea, the closer it is to that, the better it works, which to a large extent is an explanation of the incredible beauty and effectiveness of what American government has been about, with all of its flaws and problems and having to deal with things like slavery. But then they added amendments later. Go read the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments of the U.S. Constitution. The 13th is, getting rid of slavery. The 14th is, giving everyone citizenship in the United States, regardless of race, creed, or color. And the 15th is, the right to vote for everyone, universal
Right.
suffrage, at least for men at the time. Women got it later.
Right.
It was also an issue that had to come later.
Right. 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 I do think it's interesting because if I think about what we talked about last episode and this episode, in many ways, liberal democracy became the new religious identification for people. Because I was like, oh, but Jews still identified as the people of Israel, even outside of Israel when we didn't have Israel. Um, but like, would Americans identify as American if they didn't have America? And I think what I'm thinking is maybe not Americans, but people identify globally as someone who believes in liberal democracy. Like there's communism, there's totalitarianism, and there's liberal democracy. And most people kind of assume, and I think this is where we go wrong, that everybody thinks liberal democracy is the best way to go. And that's why we keep getting mixed up when we interact with cultures or civilizations that don't think that. That isn't the obvious way of things, and not everybody thinks that that's like the most moral way. Does that make sense what I'm saying? Because like I feel like, like is America the land, or is it what you're saying, which is the Constitution and a set of ideas that have kind of spread?
So in the case of America, America is unique in that national identity, when your primary identity is a nation, then what is good for your nation is what you're into, even if it means it comes at the expense of other nations, which you can, of course, subjugate, enslave, take their land, because it just makes your nation more powerful, more wealthy. So the uniqueness of the American national identity is precisely the fact that it wasn't founded on these ideas. It's like a refugee place that people came to, which, and the vision of
Right.
America
Bring
was
us your
never
sick,
about,
bring us your weak, bring us your
yeah, yeah,
right.
exactly. You're quoting Emma Lazarus, who was a Jewish woman who died at 38 years old, of probably melanoma, by the way. She died in the 19th century, and they chose her poem, the Great Colossus, I think the name of it is. They chose her poem to be at the base of the Statue of Liberty, which, and you think about it, this is so unique to America. They don't have this France gave the Statue of Liberty to America. To be fair, everyone's kind of aping after the United States as the model for how you do it right. And but the words of that are so beautiful, and something I memorized years ago: give me your tired and your poor, your huddled masses yearning to be free, the wretched refuse of your teeming shores. Send these, the homeless tempest tossed to me. I lift my lamp beside your golden door. By the way, the Statue of Liberty was designed as a lighthouse originally. Didn't work as one.
Which,
But
just
think
to
about
say, is a pretty wild sentiment when, like, right now one of the major questions is around immigration. Like, how do you do immigration well? How do we uphold that poem that's written on the Statue of Liberty? Or I guess I think it was it Elie Wiesel or Viktor Frankl that said, like, the Statue of Liberty on the east should have been balanced with the Statue of Responsibility on the west. Like, that we're trying to figure out how to do those values and at the same time have other values matter too.
Right. So this is where you're getting back to the point you were making before about people kind of walking around with a vague sense that liberal democracy is the way to go. By the way, I don't think a lot of people appreciate that. I
Mm-hmm.
think people who are thinking and understand history and have a vision of where the world has come from and also understand that liberal democracy comes hand in hand with an economic system, by the way,
Mm.
which is
Right.
which is free market economy, the same opportunities, which is why when you try and stick like socialism and communism into that system, it doesn't work because one smack it just comes right up against the other because then you start people's freedom start getting you have a quality of outcome that starts interfering with people's freedom to like achieve and go forward because then if they get forward ahead of someone else, then they're going to be penalized for it.
Right.
So, what you're really going back to is something I think we talked about last week, which is the notion of you cannot just take the nice ideas of being a refuge. It has to be nice ideas are just nice ideas unless they're couched in a concrete legal system. And as much as
Right.
people love this, Judaism is a great example of this. Some of the most powerfully expressive quotes and images that have guided the world, like what's outside the United Nations. We hold, it's not, it's like they shall beat their swords into plowshares and their spears into pruning hooks. Nation shall not lift up sword against nation, neither shall they make war anymore. That's from the book of Isaiah. It's a beautiful quote. But that has to be translated into a practical system. That's where it really gets sticky. Because if you look at Jewish law, we go back again, we see that Judaism is, we taught the world the idea of peace as an absolute standard, yet Judaism definitely allows for the reality of humanity, that war
Right.
is a part of human, even though we push for an ideal system of universal peace and brotherhood. But there's even things in Judaism, you're allowed to go to war. There's people you're allowed to kill. There's a death penalty. So you just can't throw out
Right. What's the Latin quote parabolum, right? Like this idea, like, if you want peace, you have to be ready to go to war.
It's the Roman CV. It's the Roman. It's CV pacem pare bellum. If you want peace, prepare for war. So it's not just enough. And this goes back to what we also talked about last week. Will Hilberg, the American Jewish sociologist who talked about the cut flower ethics.
Hmm.
So it's all kind of coming back. We see where we are now. We understand that, sure, we have these beautiful expressions and these quotes. We have Emma Lazarus's poem, and sure, we have these nice quotes out at the United Nations, and we have this idea of justice, equality, and peace. But as Will Herberg said, that the values of Western liberal democracy come from this Judeo-Christian ethics, which are really Jewish ethics, which Christianity passed on and spread to the world through the spread of Christianity throughout the world. But just like the flower that's cut from its roots withers and dies, you just have these nice flowery ideas and slogans, but they are that you cut them off from the actual legal, clear basis of where they come from, of how you actually apply them in a practical way in a legal system and not just nice flowery statements. It doesn't work, which is largely where the West is today. It's just can't we just all get along and love each other? And yeah, it would be very nice, but you have to live in reality and you have to have a legal system that knows how to apply it. You want people to come in to your country, but you have to have a way of controlling the flow of people. No country could allow everyone
Right.
in the world to live in their state or allow countries to literally empty their prisons out and send their prisoners to you, which is
Right.
what's going on.
I think it's also like just speaking to it from even like a self workplace, like good friends is good make good neighbors, right? That you can't have just kindness with no boundaries, right? Jewishly, we would look at that in a mystical sense in terms of you have to have chesed on one side and gevura on the other. You need boundaries. Otherwise, like chesed, that we say kindness with no boundaries is just a flood. Like it's there's no edges of the river to direct and focus it and make it powerful and purposeful. So if you have kindness with no boundaries, it's just chaos. And I think that's so much what we often focus on is just the kindness piece, but the boundaries are one of the most important underpinnings, and I think that's what you're speaking about with structure. It's both the ability to say no as well as say yes, and how do we make that an actionable system that maintains the balance of like mercy and judgment, which is, again, goes back to what we're starting to talk about with Elul and Rosh Hashanah, where we want Hashem to move from, judgment to mercy, and how do we have the right balance of those things?
Exactly. Exactly. And when we translate it into out of the individual personal, growth structure that we go through every year as a Jew, and we're like, the beauty of Judaism is you're constantly being recycled as an individual through, you get new opportunities and you're supposed to be moving forward like Slinky is the analogy I always use
Hmm.
because the system is there. It's just your job to connect to it and use it correctly. To the extent that an individual, Judaism is all about here's God, he gives you the system, he tells you how it works. To the extent that you can inculcate that in your personality as a healthy, balanced person, and holistically understand where you're supposed to be going as an individual and how the system is designed to get you there, is the extent you will get there and not be making the same mistakes or get stuck and not be growing, because the essence of being a human being is to deal with challenges and get through them and grow, to take the pain for the gain. And that kind of is a microcosm of all of human history. And if you try and do it, Judaism would say, if you try and invent it on your own and figure it out, you might get some things right, but you probably get a lot wrong. If you go to the manufacturer, the designer who actually knows it you better than you know yourself, and design the system as a perfect being to give it to you, to enable you as an imperfect being to be most as perfect as humanly possible, you'll have the easiest journey doing that. And that really is all about what human history is about on a macro level. To the extent that the Jewish people as a nation do that collectively is where we're successful. And to the
Right.
extent the world has tied into, this is reality is not a zero sum game. There's like, let's say there's like 100 principles. If you all 100 of them work, a country that does 75 is going to do a heck of a lot better than a country that does 10 of them. Like we talked about this before, that we say about democracy, we're talking about America democracy. America is a democratic republic. The idea of democracy comes from the Greeks, but so much of the foundational ideas that are the workings of American democracy come from Judaism. To the extent that the United States in its foundation was able to take a very significantly high percentage of the system, and it's not a theology. They don't have a bunch of rabbis making the US Constitution and sitting on the Supreme Court, but to the extent that they absorbed a significant, and especially the big principles, because some things are big and some things are small. The notion of God giving, like it says in the Declaration of Independence, the equality of humanity, of every human being being a child of God, and something that is like the biggest one of all. That is by far the biggest one of all of them. That we're all children of God. We're made in His image. We all are. Is a fundamental equality. How we adapt that, how we grow into that, is the great story of the evolution of America. But to the extent that you absorb these principles into who you are, is the extent that your system of government, and the quality of life of your citizens will be that much closer to the ideal format. But that involves constantly being aware of where this comes from and not cutting yourself off like the flowers in the vase. You can never lose sight of the principles that are the foundations of who you are, where you come from, and what your vision is about.
Right.
And this is what Judaism's all about. We are the people who taught the world this. Judaism's all about freedom, but it's freedom for a purpose. God didn't put us into Egypt to take us out, to give us a passport and an airplane ticket and a credit card and say, go have some fun somewhere. He
Right.
brought us in. He put us in there to bring us out, to make us a nation based on his guidelines, his playbook, not just to go to the land of Israel, build a mini empire, conquer and subjugate people. No, not at all. I always say Jews are not into empires. The only Jewish empire has been Hollywood, and it's not a source of Jewish values. But it's to create, the city on the hill, as they say about America. That ideal nation that will teach the rest of the world how to emulate us, and to the extent that they do, that's what Noahide laws are about. The non-Jewish world, from the Jewish perspective, is not supposed to become Jewish. We make it hard to convert. It's a big process. We don't force people
Yeah,
ever.
like not that we're closed to it, but we're just saying you don't have to in order to be a good person. It's one of the defining differences between Judaism and proselytizing religions is we're saying you're great. You're also you were created in God's image just like I was, and you don't have to be Jewish in order to accomplish your life's purpose and to be your best
Exactly.
self.
And you don't have to adopt 613 commandments and set up an identical lifestyle and system of government of the Jewish people. We'll give you seven big
Right.
ones. And that's
Right.
kind of like the world. And the greatness of America is that more than any other country, both in its foundation and as it evolved, and it was a bumpy road along the way because it wasn't, and even we Jews who got the system directly from God, we had a lot of bumps because we made the same mistakes. We forgot where we were coming from. We got lazy and decadent. We lost sense of our vision, that kind of stuff. But to the extent that America, more than any other country in modern history, has been able to inculcate in its vision, in its foundation, in its legal system, and its governmental structure, what is the closest thing we can get to Judaism is, to a very large extent, the reason why America has been the most successful experiment in political and economic development in the world, that has elevated more people in a shorter period of time from a very low standard of, of freedom and prosperity to an incredibly high standard. But to the extent that all those people who are benefiting from that do not appreciate how much of the world doesn't have that, and don't appreciate the journey, and actually want to even shoot themselves in their own feet by claiming that America is founded on all kinds of garbage and slavery and stuff like that, and not recognize the beauty that's within. You got to wipe off some of the dirt to see the real beauty and realize it's a work in progress.
Right.
The extent that America is in trouble today and the world is in trouble today, because the liberal democratic countries of the world, which are the bulwark against all the craziness and insanity that has plagued humanity for so long,
Right.
are in the most danger of collapse.
Yeah, I heard something so interesting, and I think this goes back to protecting our values in a particular way, which is I heard an interview with Sam Harris on the Call Me Back podcast, and he said something interesting. I think he was quoting someone else, so forgive me for paraphrasing, but he said, if liberals won't do make the hard decisions, like if liberals won't step in, and do it in a nice way, like fascists are more than happy to fill the gap. Meaning, like, if we want our liberal democracies to not just have the flowery language, but we also want to be able to protect the rights and the, abilities that we have to live these incredible lives, we also have to be willing to protect those rights. And if we don't do it in a centered way, there's a lot of people who are very harsh, who are willing to step in and make those hard boundaries for us. And we're leaving that door open when we start to be our rights and our values start to be violated, for someone to step in who doesn't necessarily have our best interests at heart, but to come in and say, "Well, I'm willing to do the job." And I think it's a really interesting commentary on like the dangers of not having the structure, which I think is what you're saying, and not having the ability to have some hard conversations.
Yeah, that is very, very true. And this I always use this to explain, Rav Chaim of Volozhin, when talking about anti-Semitism, he says when Jews don't make Kiddush, Gentiles make Havdalah. And he doesn't mean literally the ceremony we make on Friday night at the beginning on a cup of wine when we go to the higher spiritual level of Shabbat, versus the ceremony we make on Saturday night, also on a cup of wine when we go down to the lower spiritual level the other 6 days of the week. He's saying when we don't, as a nation, proactively, not through empire and conquest, but by just doing it right, fill the world with the values that God gave us, that the world really wants, but they need a practical role model to know how to emulate and follow it and see who's doing it right. Then the world will be full of the opposite values. And basically what you're saying is that if liberal democracy loses sight of what makes them great, the principles that are the foundational principles, and don't strongly support those and recognize how positive they are, then those societies will fray. And then the totalitarian societies, whatever they are in the world, whatever movement, fascism, Nazism, communism, radical jihadi Islamism, will push into that system. And the difference is, Ellie, which is really interesting. I don't know if you mentioned this before, but the fact that no democracy's ever gone to war with another democracy in history, because I always say the greatest strength and the greatest weakness of democracy is its peace between peoples. People don't want to kill each other. Dictators are happy to throw their population like sheep to the slaughter or cannon fodder into wars. You can see that over and over again. You see that with, the Soviet Union during World War II. You constantly see this stuff. Democracies are peace between peoples. The problem is, because it's between people and they don't want to die, it's very hard to get them to go to war. But think about it. If democracies, as they've evolved, especially America, which is the greatest economy in the world, that had no empire ever, England became a democracy, but it also did it in the process of having a huge empire.
Hmm.
But how come the world, if you look at how many democracies existed like 150 years ago versus how many democracies in the world today, and how many totalitarian or absolute monarchies existed 150, 200 years ago versus today, you'll see that the scale has tipped dramatically. Yet, if you look at human history, the whole history of humanity is basically civilizations and empires conquering other people and
Hmm.
pushing their values onto them forcibly, physically. How come democracies, which don't, there's no modern liberal democracy today, even the ones that have outgrown their empires, like the British, that is going around conquering and subjugating people? They had a process of trying to, the British, for instance, rid themselves of their colonialist kind of suprematist ideology that England definitely had.
Hmm.
In 1900 and before, is it England were all about, like it's Rudyard Kipling said, you should thank God you were born an Englishman and you won the lottery of life. The answer is, again, it's because when you have something that really works, you don't have to work that hard to sell it. Like I said, I always use that line, imitation is the highest form of flattery. Whenever I'm teaching, I say, you ever heard the expression, imitation is the highest form of flattery? I tell people that's the shortest class you ever got on Christianity and liberal democracy. Because if it wasn't for the Jewish people, again, going back to the beginning, taking this idea of a perfect being, giving us on a personal level and a holistic governmental societal level, the system that you cannot improve on. You can tweak it, you can adapt it, whatever, but you can improve on it. What's the core
Right.
values and the principles are there. You use that, even in bad situations, it works better than anything else. People will be drawn to you. And even if they don't become you, they will copy you, which is the whole history of Christianity. And they
Yeah,
will
and I,
take this from your book and they will adapt it, and that will grow into a form of government that will transform the world, known as modern liberal democracy.
right. So I would throw a couple of things at that. One is, look, when democracy began in North America, there was an active effort. Again, going back to, it wasn't definitely wasn't perfect in its execution, especially in the beginning, where we did try to colonize the people that we were taking the land from in terms of Native Americans and Native Canadians, and we did do some horrible things in the name of our system is better than your system and you should be like us, not like you. Which, honestly, Catholicism and Christianity did before us in the same land, in that colonizing way. So I would just sort of, just to not shove that under the rug, like democracies have done that, and to understand that more deeply, it's an important piece of the puzzle and eventually reckoned with it and said that's not the way. But I think the second piece to just notice is not everybody in the world wants democracy. Not everybody in the world wants peace. Not everybody in the world wants liberal democratic values, and not everybody in the world is interested in the idea that everybody is born in the image of God. So I think that's something that living in North America or Western democracy we tend to forget, which is what we talked about in that episode with luxury beliefs and worldviews. Is we tend to think everybody wants peace. Everybody wants to have freedom of choice. Everybody believes women should have rights. Everybody believes that gay people should be able to live their lives freely. Everybody believes that everybody should have education and everybody should vote. And it's just not true. Not
Yeah.
everybody believes that. And I think it's really hard for us to remember that in the Western democracy world because it's a delusion and it's actually a dangerous delusion these days.
Yeah, you're 100% right on both counts. Democracy is an experiment in progress. It is hardly perfect, but I always use that line. I'm sure I've said it before. Winston Churchill, he said, democracy is the worst form of government except for every other system we tried from time throughout history. So it's always been the struggle between the ideals and actually living up to them. All men are created
Right.
equal, but in 1776, US had slavery, and some of the founding fathers were slave owners, even though they were very ambivalent about it and people realized it was a problem. It was a discussion all the way back then. And you're right. These are, with the treatment of the indigenous population of the United States, 100%. Perfect system, it definitely was not. So I absolutely hear that point. But you're pointing out something, again, which goes back to this idea of people not understanding society socializes us to believe in a certain way. If you grew up in a Western liberal democratic country today, be it Europe or America, you're going to kind of operate on a basic value system, which you kind of assume is automatic, like programmed into your brain. And this is why it's so important to look back at the past and understand history to understand this is not the natural state for human beings to be in. Human
Mm,
beings be
right.
very animalistic. Like the world can be a jungle with the strong survive, the weaker lunch, which is why you have constant warfare in human history. Slavery is the most ubiquitous universal phenomenon everywhere at all time. You have conquest, you have repression, you have gross amounts of inequality in the world. And because one of the most powerful driving forces in the world is power, there'll always be people who will want to raise themselves above other people at their expense and suppress people, conquer other people, and are not operating off the same value system. One of the big mistakes that people in the West make, it's kind of it's sweet and naive, but it's very dangerous to just think that everyone thinks like me. And the
Yeah,
reality,
I
yeah,
think this is so helpful too because it helps to understand like we fundamentally believe that we should not be defined by our worst mistakes. That like in some ways like both Judaism and America or Western democracy has this idea of a growth mindset. Like I can fail and do better and get better and grow and change and fix it and move from there. And I think a lot of the rhetoric right now is no, we are defined by our worst mistakes. And if we have a worst mistake, then that means the whole system should be thrown out. And that is fundamentally not, if we come back to saying, hey, no, our values say we can mess up and we can do tshuva and we can keep going and do better this time. And I think we don't talk about that enough, maybe.
very, very possibly. Yeah, Judaism, the idea is not about sin, it's about being off the mark, which is very, very important. That's another huge idea that if you lived in the ancient world, the idea that you're trapped in a world that's full of gods that cynically use and abuse you, you really don't have any. If you read Greek tragedies like Euripides, the subplot is always the futility of fighting against your fate. It's very unempowering, and not only is it unempowering, it kind of abrogate you can abrogate your responsibility because really what I do doesn't matter. The uniqueness of Judaism, which is so much of what America is based on.
Right.
The open land of opportunity,
Hmm.
equality. Perfect system, no, but you can if you work hard. Look at how much of the world works on caste systems and status in society. Even in England, you see My Fair Lady is based on George Bernard Shaw, Pygmalion, the obsession the British had with language as an expression of class.
Right.
And you
Right.
say,
Do you speak the Queen's English or
yeah,
do you
yeah,
speak
lower
Cockney
class,
or do you right. You know who
but you're
someone is
locked
by
in
how they
there.
speak.
You're locked in there. Like you look at India with the caste system, you're a Brahmin and you can be an untouchable. So this is so not a Jewish thing. Judaism
Mm.
has this idea. There's certain things that you're locked into. Kingship, that there's a famous rabbinic statement. Kingship, you got to be from the family of King David. Priesthood, you got to be from Moses's brother Aaron. Those are inherited positions. But but Torah, and having a good name and things like that. That's to be on the Sanhedrin, by the way, which is the real judicial political body of ancient Israel, was open to anyone and everyone. It was a
Which, by
meritocracy.
the way, that's really important because, like it says in Pirkei Avot, right? Torah is considered more valuable than kingship or priesthood. Like that is actually kingship and priesthood are a second tier aspiration to obtaining wisdom and Torah and being, part of that system, which is a really
Absolutely.
interesting thing to know.
And that the real power, you can earn it. This is another thing you see today. It's a quality of opportunity, not a quality of outcome. Judaism is not about, and neither is free market economy is about this. Free market is you work hard, you're rewarded. It's incentive to be the greatest you can be and put out maximum effort, not to give you something for nothing because it's not fair.
Hmm.
So these are ideas that, again, the extent that you imitate the biblical model of which is Jewish economy is free market capitalism with a conscience, by the way. There's labor laws, there's environmental laws, there's animal rights, there's all this stuff in there. There's nothing missing from Judaism. You can't. Everything that the Western world has today that's really worked is some derivative of what's going back to this idea of being balanced and understanding. It's not all or nothing. But this is the system that cannot be taken for granted. Because if we take it for granted, and we do, because this goes back to really the issue of, if you look at humanity as we're in cycles. It's depressing when you look at the rise and fall. No matter when you look at human history, there's always an empire. And every empire and every movement, whether it's the Greeks, whether it's the Romans, whether it's Islam in the 7th century or, or in the early 8th century, that they go through a period of incredible, like it's like, the Yankees for a few years, baseball. They just got this winning season. They're like winning the World Series like 5 years in a row or something. But then the draft picks aren't so good and they go into decline. And maybe they make a comeback later. So are we destined to, like people are saying, that's it? America had its period of time, which was basically from World War One, really the American century. Really, America really starts to emerge. But World War II and onward, till the present, has been the dollar has been the currency. English. Okay, it's really America. It's because America is such a dominant country that English is the lingua franca of the world, the international language. American influence is the greatest superpower in the world. Are we destined? Is this something we are trapped in? And again, if you go back to the Torah image of the individual struggle and a nation struggle as being cyclic but not static, the same pitfalls are always there because human nature is always human nature. On an individual level, all of humanity is a collective personification of the individual personalities, of the things that are pitfalls for us, the things that we can fall into, that never change. The impact of sexuality on civilization is the same today as it was thousands of years ago. The impact of corruption. These are all the same things. But what Judaism is saying is we got to break the mold because there's a pattern. Jonathan Sachs talked about this, and he's basing it on Neil Ferguson's book. He says the West and all the rest, civilization, the West and all the rest. Are we destined to fall? Like, well, as people are paying lip service to values they take for granted and don't appreciate, they're not innate in human consciousness, as we slowly slide into a state where we get overrun by barbarians, the modern barbarians, like the Roman Empire was overrun in the 5th century in the West? Or is there a way of breaking the cycle? And there is. And it's interesting when he talks about, and Judaism, again, is kind of the model for this. The uniqueness of, like I said, the uniqueness of the Jewish people being able to do what we did was precisely that it's not a purely national identity, that we also have this faith. So we have these core values that come from God that we never separate ourselves out of. So it's always more than nationalism for us, or it's nationalism with a purpose, which has given the Jewish people a unique ability to survive, by the way, even when we lose our nation state, that and a lot of help from the big guy upstairs who controls the story, because the survival of the Jewish people against all odds is always down to ultimately a lot of stuff that is never should have happened, but there's a director to the story who's always controlling the plot. But on the level of how the ride has gone for us, it's always because we've always been able to, like the Passover Seder is probably the single best example of this, of that every year we understand, we relive where we came from and understand here's where we come from, that you have to, this is what Neil Ferguson brings down in his book. He says you have to always remember where you're coming from. Just as we, the Jewish people, have to know our beginnings, that's where America and the Western world has to understand how we got to where we got. And we have to appreciate that it wasn't always like this. And the values we have today didn't always exist. You have to, but you also have to keep your ideals in mind. You have to keep your values. You can't stray from the principles. In the case of Judaism, as the role model, the most oft repeated idea in the Bible is God says it's a contractual agreement. But you keep your side of the bargain, it'll go good for you. You have to understand what your mission is in this world and never lose sight of it. It's not like the words of
Right.
Hatik in the national anthem of Israel, just liotam chofshi b'artzeinu, just to be a free people like anyone else. No, God said, I didn't create you just to be like everyone else on a different side of the Mediterranean than the French. You got a mission in this world, but most importantly, you got to keep the faith. And that's where getting back to what we started out with.
Right.
You got to recognize that your values are based on ideas and principles that are immutable, unchanging, and you can't just decide to dump them later on. Which in America, some people are pushing that, let's dump the Supreme
Yeah,
Court.
and so I
Look
guess
it
I
up.
just just to okay, so for a moment just to separate then the two things that we've been comparing, like in Judaism we're saying come back to, right, understanding that we are a people, that we are Knesset Israel, we are also Bnei Israel, we're, God is our father, our king, we have a system, we have a set of values, and how do we live by that? What does that look like for Western democracy or America? What are they coming back to? Because we're not advocating for a new theocracy. we're saying what values do we come back to? And I guess, as we get to the end of this episode, how do we do that? What do we come back to and how do we get there?
Yeah. So in terms of America, it's going back to the beginning of what we said at the beginning of this talk and last week. It's first of all appreciating that this is not the natural state of the world. The natural state of the world is to be an animal and to the strong survive and the weaker lunch. So to appreciate when you're sitting comfortably in Italy, Spain, America, England, France, and Canada, that this was a big struggle to get where you are. And you should thank God and everything else that you're lucky enough to live at this time, that you turn on the water and you tap and it pours. You have to go walk 2 miles to a water hole, that you can go to a store and buy a loaf of bread and not spend like 6 months growing the wheat and farming. Like you're not in a subsistence level existence. You have a level of luxury and prosperity, but it wasn't always that way. Appreciate it. Absolutely.
Right.
Don't be a trust fund baby. Like don't.
Right. Yeah.
But it's also recognizing that you have to be for something that we want, that Western liberal democracy is about making this available to everyone. It's not just enough for me, a very Jewish idea, be Abraham, not Noah. You just can't be in the life raft as the rest of the world's going down the tubes. You
Right.
got to recognize that humanity has the ability, humans are unbelievable, ability to adapt and use technology and science. Used in the right way, it could be the best thing. In the worst way, it could be incredibly destructive. But to be able to feed the world and create an abundance of food and deal with water shortages and disease, it's all there. You just got to keep track with it. It's very important to be for something always and to want to
Yeah, it's
spread that.
interesting. I was gonna say, like, I had a great teacher who said once, like, don't live off of it, live for it. And there's a
Exactly.
real
Yeah.
difference. Like, you can't live off of democracy. You have to live for it, which means you got to stand for it when it's threatened.
Because if it's just me be comfortable, to hell with the rest of the world. First of all, other parts of the world that aren't getting what you're getting are going to come some pretty scary things that come after you and destroy your world. But you have to have more meaning than just being comfortable.
Mm,
Even if you enjoy all the comforts and life is so much less of a struggle, you got to have the vision. And that's going back to the Jewish thing about its freedom for a purpose. We
mm.
are the God squad. It's not about converting, it's creating the role model and bringing that beautiful vision of values that has enabled us to create such an amazing, you know, community, which is the Jewish world throughout history. We want to share that with everyone else, not by converting and conquering, but by showing that you can adapt a lot of this stuff. It works. It's applicable to you guys. But it's also most important of all, it's again, getting back to this idea of the faith. We talked about last week about how modern liberal democracy, contrary to what used to be taught, is not about the Western world freeing itself from God and faith. It's maybe getting itself away from the oppression of the Catholic Church and bringing the Bible out to the world and teaching people the correct way to have faith, which is direct relationship with God, and using the Bible to do that. But we have to remember that everything that has worked, to the extent that we can reconnect to the values that come from the big guy upstairs that knows better than we do how to run this world, and to the extent that we can incorporate these principles, not necessarily in a religious theocracy with a bunch of priests or a bunch of Jews running a country, no, but to the extent that we can inculcate those principles that work into our system, which is what Western liberal democracy is, and never lose sight, never cut the flower away from its roots. Always recognize that it is an essential part of Western liberal democracy that people maintain a relationship with God, which doesn't mean, again, forced faith. You can have freedom of conscience, but it's always a recognition that there's a higher power, that there are rules and principles and morality that is absolute, that do not change, and that maintaining fealty to that idea is the most critical thing of all, because that's what keeps us on course, and that's what it's all about. And to the extent that Western liberal democracy is able to do that, I remember last time I read this Franklin Delano Roosevelt fireside chat, and he said where we've been most successful as a nation, it's when we've kept to the principles of the Bible. And Thomas Cahill wrote this book called the Gift of the Jews, and he's really going back to the essence of what Western liberal democracy is about, that we take for granted. And he says, it's just a great quote. He came out with this book in 1998. He says, unbelievers might wish to stop for a moment and consider how completely God, this Jewish God of justice and compassion, undergirds all our values, and that it's just possible that human effort without this God is doomed to certain failure. All who share this outrageous dream of universal brotherhood, peace, and justice, who dream the dreams and see the visions of the great prophets, must bring themselves to contemplate the possibility that without God, there is no justice. And without God, without that basic, that's why the 10 Commandments are on the doors of the United States Supreme Court, by the way. And that's why in the center frieze of the building is Moses the lawgiver, along with some other famous people in Western civilization, because it's a recognition that, like they say, Athens and Rome and Jerusalem, but the role that Judaism has played in being a role model for what is that Western liberal democracy. And to the extent that, just as we Jewish people have kept our faith, know where we come from, recognize that we're a nation that has a unique mission in this world to bring these values to the world, to the extent that Western liberal democracy recognizes that it has, in a macro level, more or less that same kind of mission, is how you can break the cycle and stop the decadence and the narcissism that is in Western civilization today. Is when it becomes about me, when you lose sight. Judaism is so big. Anyone who understands Judaism understands it's all about community and communal responsibility. It's not that I'm on the life raft like Noah and you can drown. It's that we are all part of one nation. You're my brother, you're my sister. To the extent that humanity can look at itself that way and recognize that if there's a child starving in Africa who doesn't have clean water, and thousands of children die every day in Africa from
Right.
diseases related to not having clean water, and there's more than enough food and water on this planet to take care of those people. To the extent that we
Yep.
proactively use our energy and our wealth in that way, is the extent that we break that cycle and hook into that system, which is the only system that gets us out of that cycle, which is that covenantal relationship, and the vision that will give the world the true peace that it wants, and take what is empty slogans and make them a practical reality that the whole world will live with. And then you can push back on the evil. And trust me, if the Western world can stay strong, and no idea that is false, no form of government or economics that is based on inequality, injustice, violence, and everything else ever survives. But if the other side's weak, it can make inroads and do a lot of damage in the meantime. But if Western liberal democracy,
Right.
based on Jewish values, stays strong to those principles, people will just eventually just give up and join. They'll just want to show me what you're doing right. We want this. We don't want the oppression. We don't want the inequality. We don't want the poverty. We want what you have. But that means you have to buy into the system of the vision and understand what being a human being is about, and taking responsibility and being a child of God, and living with that reality.
I think it's so cool too, because I love what you're saying. It sort of backs up a theory that I have. When I work with my clients and in my classes, often I talk about that there are three main relationships: relationship with self, relationship with others, and relationship with God. And each of those relationships have to be balanced with each other. If one of them is more and the other one is less, you're going to have a society or a person who's off kilter. And it's really interesting to think about that. Yeah, if you have a society that focuses too much on me, then others and God, that's also out of balance. If you have a society that only focuses on other, or only focuses on God, all of those, like those three relationships are the legs of the chair that need to be balanced in order to have things work appropriately. And so much of Judaism is advocating for the balance of those relationships, both within, with our actions, but also with our values and our ideals. So I think that's a really cool way of looking at the world. Like, where is it out of balance in terms of the relationship focus? And it seems like that's also what you're pointing to, because if we can get back to balance and use a system that can allow us to care as much about ourselves as others as God, then we have a much better chance of making this work.
But exactly, that's a beautiful way of putting it. It's all about balance, and Judaism is totally about balance. But to bring it completely full circle to close, we're
Hmm.
talking about, we started out with Iran, saying death to America, death to Israel, and America's this symbol, and Israel's the source. There's a great quote from George Gilder, wrote a book in 2009. They just came out with a new edition of it. It's called The Israel Test,
Mm.
and it talks about why the hyper focus on Israel. And there's so many problems in the world. And it really goes back to the core of everything we're talking about. It's basically how you look at reality and how Israel defines that vision. And in fact, I just want to read you the quote because it's so powerful. He says, the
Mm.
central issue in international politics, dividing the world into two fractious armies, is the tiny state of Israel. The prime issue is not global war of civilizations. The real issue is between the rule of law and the rule of leveler egalitarianism, between creative excellence and covetous fairness, between admiration of achievement versus envy and resentment of it. Israel defines a line of demarcation. And by
Mm.
the way, I just add this quote: Western liberal democracy is all about that opportunity and egal and achievement, and that's the manifestation of that. He goes on to say, as with America, so with Israel. Israel is not an indispensable Jewish, quote, best friend, unquote, a noble but doomed democracy, or even a charitable dependency we can no longer afford. It is an indispensable ally, and in the past 20 years, it has evolved into perhaps the most valuable partner. Yet, for most Americans, ultimately, our loyalty to Israel arises not from a cold calculus of survival, but from a sense of the holy. What Americans must fathom with both heart and mind is that this instinct is true and vital to our survival, that if we would live, we must defend the Holy Land.
Wow.
It's essentially which side of this worldview are you going to be on? It's a beautiful way of putting it, which really
Yeah.
sums everything up. It's all about on whose side of the values you're going to be on.
Fascinating. Love it. I this was such an interesting follow up to the last episode, and so many good things to think about, both before the elections in America and before Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur. Yeah, I feel like all these things are kind of converging together, which is really really fascinating. And plus, we have to note coming up, soon also to the 1 year anniversary of October 7th, where so many of those values and lives were deeply violated, and really your response to October 7th is a bit of a bellwether as to where you stand with your morals and your values in your life right now.
Exactly.
Um,
Exactly.
Awesome. Thank you so much, as always, Rabbi Kanspiro. Thank you, everyone, for joining us. Thank you for listening. If you would like to listen to more episodes, of course, just find us on Spotify or Apple Podcasts, or you can go to either my website or Ken's website to find links to the podcast there. Please check us out on YouTube. We now have episodes up where you can see our lovely faces to having these conversations, as well as some shorter clips that you can share with friends. If you would like more information about the live Jewish history course that's going to be starting, taught by Rabbi Ken Spiro at 12 noon Eastern Time, that begins at the end of October, you are all welcome to join us for that course. You can go into the liner notes, and a link to register for that will be there. Um, and if you have ideas for topics or any questions for us, please feel free to get in touch. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining us. And we will, God willing, see you next week. Thanks, Ken.
Thank you. Bye.